At my daughter's wedding, I discovered the truth that changed my life forever. I remember that day perfectly. Anxiety tightened my chest, but with a twinge of happiness, an emotion I never imagined I'd feel again. My name is Helena, and it was my daughter Isabella's wedding. She was radiant, about to experience one of the happiest moments of her life, and I was supposed to be the support she needed. But deep down, I was struggling to stay calm. It wasn't just the event, but the weight of everything I'd faced before. I didn't know if I was ready to deal with another big change. My heart pounded as I walked through the corridors of the Jardim Imperial Hotel, the marble and crystal reflecting a light so intense it seemed to blind my eyes. What seemed like a dream to everyone around me became a crushing reality for me. A whirlwind of emotions, a mixture of pride and fear, and the pressure that everything had to be perfect. I couldn't make a mistake. After all, my daughter deserved the best, didn't she? But at the same time, I was lost, with memories of so many hardships past, wondering if I would have enough strength not to break down that day. It was as if the space around me was shrinking, making everything even more oppressive. Each step down the aisle felt like an eternity. The weight of my personal history, the scars I carried, followed me like a shadow. Isabella's long-awaited wedding seemed to be forcing me to confront all my insecurities. I no longer knew exactly who I was in that moment. I wasn't the perfect mother I'd always imagined myself to be. Instead, I was a woman filled with doubts, fears, and, as much as I tried to hide it, with a huge hole in my chest, caused by years of unresolved challenges. But when I looked at Isabella, at the altar, radiant as ever, something began to shift. She was there, living her dream, and all I could think about was how I could help her have a life as full as hers. And suddenly, I realized I could no longer live my life weighed down by the past. I had overcome so much to get here. I was no longer that broken woman, defeated by adversity. No, I was there, standing, with tears in my eyes, but with a heart stronger than ever. I needed to remember that. I had to remember how I had always managed to move forward, despite the difficulties. There, in the midst of that dazzling ceremony, the realization hit me overwhelmingly. Isabella was no longer the girl I'd raised. She had become a strong, independent woman, ready to embark on her own journey. And I needed to find that strength within myself, too. I needed to reconnect with the woman who had weathered so many storms and who was now about to witness the greatest moment of her daughter's life. I couldn't allow myself to wallow in fear. I could no longer let the past define me. What I did today, how I positioned myself, would be the legacy I would leave my daughter. Suddenly, a sense of calm began to invade my body. A strange but necessary peace. I looked at Isabella. She seemed so self-assured, so confident, and it made me realize she no longer needed the same mother I once was. She was no longer the woman afraid of what the future held, who feared loneliness or the idea of being inadequate. Isabella needed a mother who knew that, despite all the hardships and losses over the years, she was still capable of moving forward and finding new meaning. I had learned to be resilient, to transform pain into strength, to reinvent myself. And as she looked to the future with a radiant smile, I began to look to my own future with a clarity I hadn't had in a long time. I didn't need to be perfect. I didn't need to conform to what society dictated about what it meant to be a successful mother or woman. Perfection didn't exist. What mattered was the path I'd taken, all the internal battles I'd overcome, and how, with each step, I'd been rebuilding myself. I realized that for so long, I'd been living on autopilot, simply reacting to what life imposed on me. But in that moment, I finally decided to live according to what I truly needed for myself. Everything that had happened, the losses, the hard times, the frustrations, and the fear of failure, would no longer be a burden to carry. I had been forged by these experiences, shaped by the pain and resilience I had developed. And now, looking at my daughter's face, so happy, so free, I knew that what truly mattered was the ability to always get up, to rebuild after each fall, and, above all, to never lose hope. I wasn't there to be perfection. I was there to support, to celebrate, to be a witness to the strength that existed not only in her, but also in me. The ceremony proceeded with every detail perfectly orchestrated, but I was in a state of deep reflection. As a mother, the expectation of being at the top of my game overwhelmed me. So many times in my life, I had felt like I wasn't enough, that I was failing to be who I thought I should be. But there, In that ballroom, while everyone else's eyes were on Isabella and her fiancé, mine were on myself. I found myself finally beginning to understand that there was no single definition of what it meant to be a good mother or a good woman. I had lived my truth, and that was enough. Everything around me seemed distant, on another plane. I was, for the first time in a long time, being honest with myself. I didn't need to carry the weight of guilt, insecurity, or expectations of being the perfect image of something I could never be. I needed to be myself. And I realized that in doing so, I was giving Isabella an example of strength that was truer than any imposed perfection. She could look at me and see that, even in the darkest moments, when life seemed broken, I always managed to start over. This was the legacy I wanted to leave her. The ability to move forward, the ability to rebuild, to never give up, even when all seemed lost. Suddenly, the idea that I might make a mistake that day seemed so insignificant. I realized that mistake is a mental construct, something that only exists when we're trying to compare ourselves to others or with unrealistic expectations. Perfection isn't synonymous with happiness. I wanted my daughter to know this, that life was made of ups and downs, that nothing was linear, that obstacles were just opportunities in disguise. Today, I saw myself as a reflection of all of this. I wasn't perfect, but I was strong. I was a woman who had found her peace and courage amidst the chaos. And finally, I could truly smile, without the weight of doubt consuming me. As the ceremony progressed, I felt as if time had slowed down. The sound of the music, the sparkle in Isabella's eyes, the nervous smile of Raphael, her fiancé. Everything seemed to merge into a sense of tranquility. Yet, deep down, something inside me still stirred, a feeling that I needed to go through another test, another internal battle. But looking at my daughter, I saw in her a reflection of the woman I had become, someone who knew how to weather life's storms and even in the darkest hours, knew how to rebuild herself. It was there, in the midst of that celebration, that I realized my true achievement wasn't in being a perfect mother or a flawless woman, but in understanding and accepting my own imperfections. I learned to forgive myself, to allow myself to be vulnerable. For so long, I lived with the weight of an image I wanted to project, afraid that people would notice my weaknesses. Today, looking at Isabella, I knew she would never expect perfection from me, because she knew me deeply. And most importantly, I knew she would also learn to accept herself, with all her strengths and weaknesses. She would grow up knowing that true strength lies in vulnerability, in the act of moving forward even when life challenges us. The feeling of pride that washed over me was indescribable. Isabella was about to take the next step in her life, and I knew she had the strength she needed to face whatever lay ahead. But I also knew that this strength didn't come from me as a mother. It wasn't the support I always imagined would be the key to her success. The true gift I gave her was the ability to learn from my mistakes, the freedom to be imperfect, the courage to rebuild after each setback. I realized that, while I thought I should be a perfect mother, it was my example of overcoming obstacles that helped her grow. In that moment, while everyone around me celebrated, I felt a peace I had never experienced before. I was no longer trying to be the mother everyone expected, or the woman society idealized. I had finally freed myself from these invisible chains that imprisoned me. I was there, with Isabella, watching her daughter become a strong, confident, and self-assured woman. I knew she also carried within herself a part of me, of my story of resilience, and that, just like me, she could overcome anything. She saw in me an example that no matter how much life knocks us down, we can always get up and start over. The ceremony ended, and as the guests filed into the banquet, I stood there for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of everything that had happened. I had gone through a painful process of self-discovery, of overcoming my own limitations, but I finally felt at peace with everything I was. For all those years, I had always sought validation from others, the approval of everyone around me. But there, in that moment, it was as if I had finally given myself that validation. I didn't need the approval of others to feel complete. I was already enough. I had overcome so much to get to this point, and that was already a triumph. As the party was in full swing, and laughter and conversation filled the air, I began to walk among the guests, with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I was no longer that tense, insecure woman, afraid of being judged. There was no longer room for that constant anxiety. The emotion I carried now was a mixture of gratitude and understanding. I was living a unique moment, but at the same time, I understood that it wasn't the end of anything, but the beginning of a new phase in my life. And most importantly, I realized that what Isabella needed from me now wasn't an idealized version of her mother, but a woman who understood the importance of reinventing herself. As I watched Isabella's happy moments with Raphael, a sense of fulfillment washed over me. This wasn't just a wedding, but a milestone of transformation. Isabella was ready to follow her own path, and I, at the same time, was ready to follow mine. From that moment on, I knew I had more to offer myself. I didn't need to live trapped in the past, in mistakes, in guilt. Life challenged me, and I, with all my imperfections, was ready to face it with renewed courage. I always thought the greatest gift I could give my daughter was a secure, flawless future. But over the years, I realized the greatest lesson I could pass on to her was that life is full of ups and downs, and what truly matters is the ability to learn from each experience. When I looked to the future, I no longer saw an endless road of challenges, but a series of new opportunities to grow. And most of all, I realized I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to keep walking, certain that true strength lies in continuing, even when the path seems uncertain. As the guests danced and celebrated, something inside me told me that this was my moment to reclaim what I had left behind. I had lived my life as if I were merely a supporting role in other people's stories, always trying to please, always trying to make everything work out for everyone around me. But that day, something shifted. I realized that the story of my life was not defined by others' expectations, but by my ability to be true to myself, to embrace my journey with all the imperfections that made it unique. Isabella was dancing with Raphael, and I was there, watching, my heart filled with pride and a sense of lightness. Finally, I realized that my daughter didn't need a perfect mother. She needed a mother who was genuine, who had the courage to be who she was, without masks. I wanted her to know that ultimately, the greatest strength anyone can have is not in never failing, but in having the courage to start over after each fall. This was the truth I wanted to convey to her, that life isn't about never making mistakes, but about learning from each one and moving forward. Suddenly, I felt a warmth in my chest, a sense of clarity so intense it almost took my breath away. I was no longer lost. I was there, with all my weaknesses and strengths, with all my scars, and yet completely alive. I had overcome so much adversity, so many internal battles, and I never thought I would get this far. But in that moment, as I watched my daughter, I knew the greatest victory was mine. True overcoming wasn't found in an event or an accolade, but in the ability to look to the past and still believe in the future. I was ready to embrace that future, unafraid of what would come. As the night unfolded and the stars shone brightly in the sky outside, I found myself reflecting on what it truly meant to overcome. It wasn't just about the external difficulties, the ones that come to us from outside, but about the internal battles, the ones we fight alone. Throughout my life, I had always feared falling, the moments of fragility, as if they would define me. But now I knew that falling wasn't the end. I had always managed to get back up, and each time I did, I became stronger. I no longer needed to fear my weaknesses, because they were already part of who I was. Looking at Isabella, I felt an immense love. A love that was no longer just mother-daughter love, but a love of understanding, of mutual acceptance. I knew that, like me, she would face life's ups and downs, and I knew she would learn to be strong, not by never failing, but by always rising when life challenged her. I wanted her to know there was no shame in doubting, in making mistakes. The shame lay only in the idea of never trying, of never giving herself the opportunity to grow. I knew that she, like me, would make her own journey of overcoming, and I would be there, not to prevent her from making mistakes, but to support her every step of the way. I was no longer the woman afraid of failure. I no longer had to carry the burden of unrealistic expectations about what a mother or a woman should be. I had overcome that. No, my overcoming wasn't in having all the answers, or in conforming to other people's standards. My overcoming was in the act of allowing myself to be who I am, with my flaws and strengths, and being able to look back and realize that, even in the face of hardship, I always knew how to find a way back to myself. I was no longer afraid to follow that path, because I knew it would take me exactly where I needed to be. The night seemed to be slipping away, but I couldn't help but think about how far I'd come. For years, I'd looked at my life with a sense of failure, that the pieces never quite fit together. But now, in the midst of Isabella's wedding celebration, everything seemed to make sense. I had overcome my own limitations, faced my fears, and, most importantly, learned to love myself in a way I never imagined possible. I was no longer a victim of circumstance. I was a transformed woman, ready to embrace life without the weight of the past holding me back. As the music began to play more softly and the hall lights reflected off the crystal ceiling, I felt a deep connection with the present. I was there, in that moment, whole. I wasn't a version of myself constructed to please or meet expectations, but an authentic version, with all my marks and scars. I knew my journey of overcoming would not end that day. It was an ongoing process. Every day would be an opportunity for me to continue rebuilding myself, and this gave me a sense of freedom I had never experienced before. As I watched Isabella dance with Raphael, I could see how she was becoming the woman I always knew she would be. And it was in that moment that I realized how important my example of overcoming adversity had been to her. She had grown up knowing that life wasn't about perfection, but about resilience. I had taught her to see difficulties not as barriers, but as challenges to be overcome. She had a strength within her that I knew would sustain her, just as I had found strength in my own scars. As the evening drew to a close and the last guests began to say their goodbyes, a sense of satisfaction washed over me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I was at peace with it. I had learned that life didn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. The struggles I'd faced, the scars I carried, all of it had led me here. And every experience, good or bad, had contributed to who I am today. I no longer needed to fear being imperfect, because my authenticity, my ability to be true to myself was what made me strong. I was finally ready to live the future, without fear of making mistakes, without fear of failing. Because now I knew, mistakes are just part of the journey, and they don't define who we are. What defines us is the courage to continue, to keep moving forward, even when things don't go as planned. My daughter now had her own life to live, but I knew that the legacy I wanted to leave her was not one of perfection, but of perseverance. I taught her to get back up after every fall, to never give up, to always believe in tomorrow. And that day, I felt I had fulfilled my mission as a mother. Isabella's wedding was undoubtedly one of the most special moments of my life, but it was also the turning point. The moment I embraced my own journey, with all its ups and downs. I not only saw my daughter begin her own story, but I also saw the beginning of my own new phase. I was ready for whatever came my way. No longer afraid, no longer in doubt. I had overcome my own story, and in doing so, I showed her that true strength lies in allowing yourself to grow, learn, and move forward, no matter what life throws at us.